Hey everybody, Miss Dupree here. This lesson is about cells. We have learned that all living things are made of cells. Plants, animals, fungi, slime, bacteria, amoeba, even you. All are made of cells. In fact, cells are the building blocks of life. That's because all living things are made of cells. A cell is the smallest thing that can still be called alive. The word organism means living thing, and there are millions of different types of organisms on Earth. They're all made of cells. Some organisms are as small as one single cell. Other organisms are made of millions, billions, or even trillions of cells. There are many different types of cells: skin cells, muscle cells, blood cells, nerve cells, and more. These cells make up every part of an organism. All cells come from other cells. Cells reproduce simply by splitting in half. Instead of one cell, now you have two. When scientists study organisms, they can classify them into one of two groups based on what type of cells they have. There are two main types of cells: prokaryotic and eukaryotic. A prokaryotic organism will be made only of prokaryotic cells. A eukaryotic organism will be made of only eukaryotic cells. So it's important that you understand the basic differences between these types of cells. I like to use an analogy that I call skateboard or sports car. Both of them are used for transportation, getting you from one place to another. But they are very different. A skateboard is small and very simple, made of only a few parts. Sports cars, on the other hand, are pretty different. They are much larger and fancier. Sports cars have a lot of different parts that help them function, such as the steering wheel, engine, battery, gas tank, etc. Just like a skateboard and a sports car, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are very, very different. Both of them are cells, of course, the basic building blocks of life. In this lesson, you will compare prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. During this presentation, you need to fill out your graphic organizer so that you can use it to study and learn about these cells. So be sure to pause the video while you are writing down information until your graphic organizer is complete. Okay, let's get started. The first organisms that formed on Earth were very, very small and very, very simple. These organisms were prokaryotic. Prokaryotic cells first formed about 3.5 billion years ago on Earth. So prokaryotic organisms are the very oldest life forms on Earth. About 1.5 billion years after the prokaryotic cells came eukaryotic cells. The first eukaryotic cells are believed to have been formed about 2 billion years ago. So eukaryotic organisms have not been on Earth as long as prokaryotic organisms. Prokaryotic cells are the older cells, and eukaryotic cells are the younger cells, if you're talking about how long they've been on Earth. The first organisms, the prokaryotic ones, were extremely simple and very, very tiny. So prokaryotic cells are also very tiny. Eukaryotic cells are much, much larger. You can often identify a prokaryotic or a eukaryotic cell just by observing their size. Prokaryotic cells are tiny, and eukaryotic cells are larger. You may have heard of DNA when you watched crime shows on TV. The detectives use DNA evidence to identify the criminal, right? DNA is genetic material. It's what makes you, you. You get your DNA from your parents, but only you have the exact combination of DNA that's inside your body. DNA acts like a blueprint to build your body. DNA is what determines your hair color, eye color, skin color, height, and many, many other things. All organisms have DNA, and it's found inside of cells. So this means that both prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells have DNA inside of them. But the place where the DNA is held inside the cells is very different. Prokaryotic cells have the DNA spread all through the cells. There's no special place where the DNA is kept. On the other hand, in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is held in something called the nucleus. The nucleus is like an envelope inside the eukaryotic cells, and one of its jobs is to hold the DNA. So prokaryotic cells have DNA, but no nucleus to hold it. Eukaryotic cells have DNA, and it's found inside the nucleus. You've heard of organs, right? Your heart, stomach, brain, and lungs are all organs. The organs in your body each have a job to do. Your heart pumps blood, your stomach digests food, your brain is your thinking center, and your lungs capture air. You have many different organs inside your body, and each one has its own job to do. Some cells have special parts inside of them that also do jobs for these cells. These special parts are called organelles. Organelles are the organs inside of cells. Just like organs, organelles have special jobs too. The nucleus is an organelle that acts like the control center of the cell, kind of like the brain of the cell. The mitochondria are organelles that make energy for the cells, kind of like the muscles of the cell. The vacuoles are organelles that act like storage centers, holding food and water that the cell needs. Not all cells have organelles. Prokaryotic cells, those very small, very simple cells, they don't have organelles. They're too simple for that. Prokaryotic cells really only have a few very basic parts. Eukaryotic cells are much more complex. They have many organelles inside of them to do many different jobs for the eukaryotic cells. So if you see a picture of a cell that doesn't really have much inside of it but some strands of DNA, it's going to be a prokaryotic cell. If the cell seems to have lots of different structures inside of it, then it's going to be a eukaryotic cell. Based on the descriptions of prokaryotic, the small, simple cells, and eukaryotic, the larger, fancier cells, what types of organisms do you think would have prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells? If you think that small, basic organisms have prokaryotic cells, you're absolutely right. Bacteria, what we think of as germ cells, are an example of prokaryotic organisms. In fact, bacteria are the only type of organisms that have prokaryotic cells. Bacteria were some of the first organisms on Earth. There are millions of different types of bacteria, but they are all basically the same. Very small, single-celled, very, very simple organisms with prokaryotic cells. So if you're looking at a tiny prokaryotic cell, you are looking at a bacteria. Organisms with eukaryotic cells are much, much more advanced. All organisms that are not bacteria will have eukaryotic cells. This includes single-celled organisms in the protist kingdom. They may be small, but they are still much more complex than bacteria. Eukaryotic organisms also include fungus, such as mushrooms and mold. All plants and all animals are eukaryotic. Just think of how advanced the cells must be to make a plant or an animal. So, if it's not a bacteria, then that means it must be a eukaryotic organism. Okay, let's review and make sure we remember the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are primitive. The word primitive means basic or simple, like our skateboard example. You can remember the PR in prokaryotic matches the PR in primitive. Prokaryotic cells are the earliest life forms on Earth. They first formed about 3.5 billion years ago. They are very, very tiny and very, very simple. They have DNA inside of them, but it is spread through the cell instead of being held inside a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus and no other organelles. Prokaryotic organisms include bacteria and only bacteria. Eukaryotic cells are much more advanced. In fact, eukaryotic cells are often called true cells because they were the first cells seen under a microscope. You can remember that "you" in eukaryotic sounds like the word true, the true cells. Eukaryotic cells are like our sports car example. They are much larger and more complex than prokaryotic cells. They have only been on Earth for about 2.2 billion years, so they're not as old as the prokaryotic cells. They have DNA that is enclosed inside an organelle called a nucleus. Eukaryotic cells also have small organelles inside of the cell that do different jobs for the cell. Examples of eukaryotic organisms include protists, fungi, plants, and animals. In our next lesson, we will be learning about how scientists classify all organisms on Earth. So it's important that you understand the first, most basic division that scientists make, and that's whether an organism is prokaryotic or eukaryotic. You absolutely must know that prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, and that eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus to hold the DNA. Make sure that you understand the basic characteristics of each of these two types of cells. If you have any questions, ask your teacher. Good job!